النساء كان عندي هنا أميرة حب ثم ضاعت أميرة حسناء كان عندي هنا أميرة حب ثم ضاعت أميرة حسناء.
Sheb Abed, Mahaba Iraq. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Our guests are the Nobel Economics Laureate, Joseph Stiglitz, professor at Columbia University, and Linda Bilmes, professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. They've written a book together. They've published today, The $3 Trillion War, The True Cost of the Iraq Conflict. I want to ask you about more of President Bush's comments from Thursday. He said the United States is not heading into a recession.
I don't think we're headed to a recession, but no question we're in a slowdown, and that's why we acted strongly with over $150 billion worth of pro-growth economic incentives, mainly money going into the hands of our consumers, and some money going to incent businesses to invest, which will create jobs.
Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, first of all, the economy is almost surely heading into a recession. I was at the American Economic Association meetings. In the past, the probability of going into recession was 50-50. The general consensus is now 75% probability of going into recession. But whether we go into recession or not, the real fact is that it is a major slowdown. It's going to be one of the, I think, clearly the deepest downturn in the last quarter century. The loss of output, the difference between the actual output and our potential output, will be at least $1.5 trillion, and that's not money we're talking about in this $3 trillion war. This is a serious problem. And I think at the core of this is the war. You know, in the election campaign, people said there are two big issues, the economy and the war. I think there's one big issue, and that's the war, because the war has been directly and indirectly having a very negative effect on the economy.
Well, could you talk about that somewhat, because you obviously go into that in your book, the impact of the enormous borrowing that occurred to finance the war at the same time that the president put through tax cuts, unheard of, that we go into war and we cut taxes rather than raise them, and also just the impact then that spread throughout the entire economy in terms of the housing crisis that we're into now.
Well, this was one of the big points that came up in the joint committee hearing that we were in yesterday.
You testified yesterday before Congress.
That's right, and this was one of the big points, that in every other war there has been what you might call shared sacrifice. Some people obviously sacrificed more, putting their lives at risk, but everybody was asked to sacrifice. This is the first time that at the time we went into war, we actually cut taxes rather than raise taxes. And even as we were cutting taxes, we already had a very large deficit. So that means this war has been totally financed by deficit. And that's really been the trick that the Bush administration, it wanted people to think that there are no economic trade-offs. We could have a war for free.
And those deficits, the financing came increasingly from abroad, right?
Very much so, at least 40% from abroad. So that means Americans will be paying those abroad interest. And the other aspect of that's really important to realize is that while we were saving zero, or household saving went down to zero, the government had negative saving, we were borrowing, the pools of wealth that were being created were in the Middle East, China. So when we have an economic problem, like the fact that Citibank and Merrill Lynch had to be bailed out, they had to turn to these others, to the sovereign wealth funds that were held by other countries, and that makes us more dependent on abroad.
Who is profiting from this war?
Well, actually, there are two big gainers in this war, and only two, the oil companies and the defense contractors. And you see that where the pools of wealth are being created. One of the big pools of wealth are in the Middle East. The countries that are the oil exporters. We are transferring hundreds of billions of dollars from American consumers, businesses, to the oil exporters. You can look at it as simple as that.
Which countries?
Well, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela. You know, if you asked who were the countries that we would not want to help, many of them would be on the list that we have been helping.
So what do you think of our headline today? President Bush helps the axis of evil, Iran and Venezuela. They benefit from the war in Iraq.
They are the big beneficiary. That's very clear. You know,
His axis of evil, I should say.
Exactly. And one of the things that, you know, we as economists, we talk about opportunity cost. What you could have done with $3 trillion to win the hearts and minds, to advance security. One of the aspects of this, everybody talks about security. While we were focusing on weapons of mass destruction that did not exist in Iraq, another country joined the nuclear club, North Korea. And so it shows you, you know, there's a limited resources, time and effort, and we were focusing on the wrong problem. While we were focusing on Iraq, the problems in Afghanistan got worse. And the problem of security in Afghanistan is much worse than it was 5 years ago. So there's not only an economic opportunity cost, there's a security opportunity cost.
Well, I'd like to ask you about how the presidential candidates are dealing with this. Obviously, both on the Democratic side, both of the remaining candidates are saying that they're going to pull out of the Iraq war, although, as we've examined on this show, what they define as pulling out is not quite really pulling out. It's still maintaining considerable forces and also continuing to build the U.S. military budget. Whereas we're already spending as much on our military budget as the rest of the world combined, and why anyone would want to spend more is beyond me. But your sense of how the candidates are positioned to be able to, in terms of their campaign rhetoric, to deal with some of these problems.
Linda Bilmes.
Well, I think that both the Democrats are clearly interested in examining the issues around how much money we would have to spend to stay in Iraq, but I'm not sure that they are looking at it the way we would advise them to look at it. And what we would say is that right now we spend $12 billion a month in Iraq alone, $16 billion if you include Afghanistan.
And that doesn't include the cost down the line.
Doesn't include the cost down the line. So if you include just the cost that we've already incurred for veterans and replenishing equipment and so forth, it's double that. It's $25 billion a month. So 2 more years of staying in Iraq is another $600 billion. 3 more years, and you're getting close to $1 trillion more. I guess what we would urge is for the candidates to consider whether U.S. security objectives would be best served by spending that additional $600 to $900 billion by retaining our troops in Iraq. You know, it seems to us that one could look at many other ways to spend that kind of money that would achieve our objectives better. And this, I will say, was brought home to me yesterday when a Navy SEAL, former student of mine, came into my office. He'd just been back from 15 months in Iraq. And the Navy SEALs do a very, very difficult job. And he had been in Anbar province, where he had captured the #2 al-Qaeda in Iraq leader in Anbar province. This was a big, big catch for him. And he lost a number of men. It was a very, very difficult period for him.